What do you make of the timing of not only the U.S. pushing through with the revoking of this special status, but also China trying to push through this legislation so fast?
Yeah, well, initially, of course, the guidance was the Chinese state was going to be around August, and they've pushed it up because they want to get ahead of any major demonstrations on the ground in Hong Kong in commemoration of the handover. Once that happened, I mean, the United States, the Trump administration is not doing well in an election period, as I'm sure you know. I mean, they're down to 40% in their blended approval rate for all the polls. They're well down on Biden, double digits national polls, significant single digits in swing states, and the managing of coronavirus is going badly. The blame for that from the Trump administration is firmly on China, and they don't want to get rid of the Phase 1 trade deal, at least not yet. And you saw that with Trump's response, slapping back Peter Navarro when he did the CNBC interview last week that sent futures diving. But on every other issue, on Hong Kong, on technology, on South China Sea, on Taiwan, you are seeing strong bipartisan opposition, and no one's going to look askance at President Trump for whacking China over unilaterally changing the terms of Hong Kong's special status, of Hong Kong's autonomy. The Americans aren't changing the status here. The Chinese are, and the Americans are only recognizing it.
I recently spoke to the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Kelly Craft, and she kept insisting that the Hong Kong issue was a human rights issue. We have seen the Trump administration, though, despite the fact that tensions have risen over the past few years, they really refrained from touching the human rights problem. We have seen the Trump administration now signing that legislation against oppression of Uyghur minorities. Is this now somewhere that we're going, given the escalation now between the two sides?
I mean, not really. I mean, you mentioned the Uyghur legislation, but Trump himself didn't want to push that. Once it passes overwhelmingly in Congress, it wasn't his legislation. He wasn't demanding it. You know, you can either sign it or you can veto it, then it's going to come back and override your veto. So, I mean, that was not something he needed to get into a fight with his own Republican legislators over. And, I mean, Trump personally, his interest in human rights is close to nil in the context of American presidents, but he is strongly focused on being tough on China. And I mean, you know, Ambassador Kraft can talk about this human rights issue. Mike Pompeo has certainly spoken of Chinese human rights aggregations in the past. But if you ask why President Trump is taking the decisions about Hong Kong that he is, and ultimately these are being decided by the president, it has nothing to do with human rights. It has to do with slapping back the Chinese on changing the legal status that they had afforded and that they were committed to continuing to afford the Hong Kong residents living there. Of course, you know, the life of a Hong Konger going forward is going to be very different. This national security legislation is very, very vague. It will provide the Chinese government the authority to subvert judicial rulings as they see fit. It depends on how they define national security, how they define sedition, how they define threatening the government of China. That kind of ruling means that anyone who is seen as problematic to Chinese patriotism is in legal jeopardy on the ground in Hong Kong. That is very far from autonomous rule for the Hong Kong government.
So, Ian, supporters of the bill have repeatedly told us that, you know, without obviously having seen the text of the legislation at all, have consistently said that this adds certainty when it comes to businesses, when it comes to the economy, and in terms of the application, it's very narrow in scope. So does, you know, a piece of legislation like this bring some certainty to Hong Kong, which has suffered economically, socially over the last 12 months with these ongoing protests?
I don't think so. Again, I think that the application of this legislation could be extremely broad. I think the answer is we don't know. It depends on how the Chinese decide that their national security apparatus that's going to be set up inside Hong Kong is going to act, what kind of intelligence sharing and collection they believe that only they can provide, as opposed to Hong Kong, how broad the cases will be in actuality, and what will they affect, and what kind of a chilling effect will it be that you don't even need to bring a case. You can simply tell someone that you're monitoring you're going to need to act differently, or we will bring a case. That or else, those consequences will themselves change. They'll police the behavior of many erstwhile democratic protesters on the ground in Hong Kong. So I do think this is a game changer for Hong Kong autonomy and long term. I think if you're a Western investor and you're wondering whether or not rule applies in Hong Kong, independent judiciary authority applies in Hong Kong, and can you still count on that to maintain your presence there and the presence of your expats? The answer is no. It's not whether, but when you decide to make a change. I think that's pretty clear now to everybody.
So the move today was interesting because we know that President Trump's base, at least, probably doesn't care about this issue, right? But it folds into his playbook in getting tough on China as we hurtle towards November. So how does it play into then also maintaining the trade deal?
Well, he needs to blame someone for a couple 100,000 Americans dead before November of coronavirus that he said was going away. It was going to be a miracle, and he said it would be a win if it was under 100,000 dead. You know, it's hard to just blame the Democrats, right? Especially when red states are making mistakes now, too, avoiding CDC guidance. People aren't wearing masks, and now your own Republican governors are saying we need to close bars, for example. We need to close gyms, for example. I mean, you can go after de Blasio and Cuomo. It is Newsom. It is really hard to go after DeSantis and Abbott, the Republican governors who have been so popular on the GOP side. So you're blaming China, and blaming China in terms of the original sin of covering up a month of the virus, both with their own people, but also with the WHO. And you're blaming them for the fact they do not accept a level playing field with Western corporations. That those positions, you can say it's not, you know, that Trump's base isn't very interested. The fact is that those are very popular positions across the entire American spectrum. And, you know, frankly, I mean, even though I find it abhorrent, even the anti-Chinese racism that Trump is starting to traffic in, directly, personally, is pretty popular beyond just Trump's base. And he needs things that are popular beyond his base, because right now, if you look at how he's polling vis-a-vis Biden, the only thing he wins on is how he handles the economy. He's well behind on every other single thing. Now, you asked, what does that mean for the Phase 1 trade deal? Well, when I've spoken with White House advisors, they've told me they don't think the trade deal will stay in place. But they don't want to kill it now because the impact on the markets is going to be negative. You want to wait on that until the election is much closer. And then if you need it and Trump is behind, then all bets are off. You know, then it really gets mean. But right now, we understand that if you pull that trade deal off, you know, Trump can say that the Chinese are paying for the tariffs, but you and I and the audience here all know that the Americans are paying for the tariffs. And they don't like paying for the tariffs. You get rid of the Phase 1 trade deal, they're going to be paying a lot more for the tariffs at a time that you've got double-digit unemployment and a contraction of the U.S. economy of 8%.
Ian,
not a happy thing.
Just quickly, before we let you go, I want to ask about China and Chinese ambitions. We have seen it really try to exert its influence in the South China Sea. Its Belt and Road Initiative. Is Hong Kong just the start?
Oh, yeah. Hong Kong is just the start. I think this is absolutely going to get worse on both sides. We're seeing a decoupling of relations between the U.S. and China. There's absolutely no trade. There's absolutely no trust between the two countries. And on pretty much, I mean, you are hard-pressed to find a single issue, social, cultural, travel, tourism, education, economic, military, you name it. These relations are getting worse. And so the fact that we can still hold on to the fact that the relatively limited phase one trade deal is holding on by a thread, and that's all we managed to have between the world's two largest economies in the middle of the worst crisis of our lifetime, that's not a good backdrop.